Okay, got it. Can you see the presentation now?
Yes,
perfect.
We can see it
okay.
well.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I'm trying to doing this very quickly in order to recover some of the time that we lost. So the name of my presentation, which it's the name of the book I'm writing, or the it's not a final title, but probably it will be a title something like that. And the title is The Hidden Paradox of Democracy and Education, Political Mobilization and Education Quality. And I'm going to divide the presentation in two parts. In the first part, I would like to tell you the story of the educational reform that we did in Mexico between 2012 and 2018. And then I will try to make very quickly some comments, some more analytical comments, and I will put some comparative perspective using other cases and comparing Mexico with other countries, which is actually what I'm doing now with my book, which my book obviously has a center on Mexico. Nonetheless, it's quite an analytical book and also a comparative book between different democracies around the world. So let me start with the case of Mexico. And I'm going to be traveling in time during my presentation. So we're going to start, sorry for this, but I don't know why is this, but well, you can see there, right? Okay, well, this started in 2012 first, when President Enrique Peña won the, here you are, I think that's better, right? Okay, well, I don't know what's happening, but anyway. So this starts in 2012 when President Enrique Peña won the election. However, I would like to start and I would like to go back 30 years in order to put in context that moment and the educational reform, but also other reforms that we did. So only 30 years before that election, in 1982, Mexico was a closed economy. The Mexican economy had a high degree of economic state control. Basically, the exports of Mexico were oil. 80% of Mexican exports in 1982 were oil. And of course, Mexico was a non-democratic country with an hegemonic ruling party. Actually, as you can see here, there is President López Portillo. He was president in 1982. And some years before, when he was a candidate, he was the only candidate who won that election, and he won with more than 90% of the votes, because the opposition did not present candidates as a way of protest, because elections were not fair and were uneven. So that was Mexico. I mean, in a very short picture, in 1982. If we go back again to 2012, only 30 years later, which in historical times is basically nothing, Mexico was already an open market-based economy. Mexico at that moment already had free trade agreements with North America, NAFTA, but also with the European Union, with Japan, with many countries in Latin America. And at that moment, Mexico was one of the most open economies in the world. The structure of exports radically changed and basically reversed. At that moment, 80% of Mexican exports were manufactures, and only 20% of exports were oil. And the value of Mexican exports were greater than the Latin American exports combined, all countries from Latin America. So Mexico, the value of Mexican exports were higher than the rest of Latin America. And of course, Mexico at that moment was already a multi-party competitive democracy. So it was a huge change in only 30 years. very positive change from my point of view. And the majority of those changes happened in the 90s. So in 2012, although for historical times was basically nothing in terms of time, but we already had and we already experienced some of the good things, but also the problems of having a free market, open economy, and also some of the challenges of democracy. So for instance, the main challenges, or some of the main challenges in 2012 were economic monopoly, the Mexican economy, which always has been very unequal and concentrated, but after the market reforms and after having free trade agreements, the monopolies in Mexico concentrate even more, and it was a huge problem and a huge challenge. Take, for example, the telecom sector, which was a monopoly, and the prices of telecom in Mexico, telephone and internet, were some of the highest in the world. The level of investment was relatively low. And for instance, the penetration and the connection of internet in Mexico was also very low because of that monopoly. But you had that problem in many key sectors of the Mexican economy. We also had a huge problem on security, low taxation, which has been one of the main structural problems in Mexico since Mexico was independent, or basically since ever. But reform the tax system at that moment was even more difficult because of democracy. And we obviously had a broken education system. I'm going to talk about this later. And we have a divided government with gridlock. Since 1997, presidents in Mexico have not had majority at Congress, which on the one hand was a good thing and was a result from democracy. Nonetheless, reforms were basically impossible. And also vested interests, such as monopolies, or in the case of education, as we will see, teachers' unions were extremely effective in terms of blocking reforms because Congress was divided. So that was the situation in 2012, and this was the context. So we started, let me put it like that, we started the government in 2012 with a political agreement, which was the first time that Mexico, under democracy and basically ever, Mexico had a multi-party agreement. It was not a coalition government because the opposition did not form part of the government. Nonetheless, it was a multi-party agreement with all the main political parties at that moment. The main political parties, our party at that moment, the PRI, was a party in the center, and we were able to craft that coalition with the main parties from the left and also the main parties from the right. And that coalition was named Pacto por México. And with that coalition, we were able to negotiate and structure and pass more than 10 structural reforms on economic competition, for instance, on telecom, a tax reform, and many other reforms. But the most important reform was the educational reform. You can see here the pictures. One of the pictures was the day the President Peña and the leaders of the parties and all the governors signed the agreement. This was the second day of the government of President Peña. And then in the other photograph, you can see me. At that moment, I was the chief of staff of the president. And my main responsibility at that moment was to basically craft the alliance and negotiate with parties, with the leaders of the parties, and also with the leaders in the Senate and in Congress, their reforms. And in that picture, I'm with the leaders of the three main parties, the leader of the PRI, the leader of the PAN, and the leader of the PRD, which were the main political parties at that moment. So we started like that government. And the first reform was the educational reform, because it was by far the most important reform, and because, as you can see, the education system in Mexico was broken. And let me show you just some figures. Those are figures of 2012. Unfortunately, at that moment, less than 1% of students in Mexico were able to distinguish between fact and opinion after reading a short text. This is with results of the PISA exam. Only 6% of Mexican students were in the 3 highest levels of the PISA exam. And on the contrary, almost half of the students, 45% of the students, were in the lowest level of the PISA exam. So that was dramatic. And it was obviously the main challenge for Mexico. I mean, centrally because, and that was our main thesis, without the quality of education, it is not possible to really exercise freedom. If you don't have a good education, you cannot really choose between options, professional options, job options. It is very difficult to really live the life that you want to live. And also it's very difficult to have autonomy. And therefore education is very important for many things. It's important for economic growth. It's important to, in order to reduce inequality, but also it's fundamental in order to exercise freedom. And at that moment, Mexico, we were starting to experience democracy and free market, and the exercise of individual freedom was central for a project, of a democratic project in Mexico, and therefore education was also central. But as you can see, with those results, it was basically impossible for the majority of the population to really exercise their freedom with those very low levels of quality of education. So, which was the main problem. And of course, like complex phenomena, the challenges within the educational system were multiple, and we have many challenges within the educational system in Mexico. However, the most important element, not only in Mexico but everywhere, is the quality of teaching. And the evidence about that, the evidence about the importance of teachers and how teachers are the most single important element in schools, it's overwhelming. So for instance, I'm just taking, I don't want to be very technical in this presentation, but I'm just presenting 3 facts from different economists of education. For instance, Professor Hanushek, who is at Stanford University, and Rockefeller. And this is, that evidence is, as I said, is vast and it's overwhelming. So the first one is that the difference between a good and a bad teacher is equivalent to 1 year of learning per grade level. That's in basic education, a primary level. Second, 3 consecutive years with a good teacher match the learning of low-income children with middle-class children. And 3, good teachers reduce school dropouts, increase college graduation rates, and help secure better jobs. So the importance of teachers is absolutely central. And the main problem with the quality of teaching in Mexico, and as we will see in many other democracies around the world, it was not a problem of policy, it was a problem of politics. And basically the problem was that the status quo in Mexico, which the educational status quo was, it was conformed by the teacher unions, political parties, and the government centrally, blocked the professionalization of teachers. And the main problem was that union leaders controlled the professional career of teachers. They controlled the process of hiring and the process of promoting teachers. They controlled the payrolls and they control the transfers, which all those things are very valuable for teachers, of course. And centrally, in alliance with party leaders, union leaders forced teachers to mobilize for elections and for protests in exchange of being hired, in exchange of being promoting, in exchange of receiving their salary or an increase in salaries, and of course, in exchange of transfer from one school to another. So basically, they were forcing teachers to mobilize. And therefore, teachers' union in Mexico were a political machine extremely efficient in order to get votes during election, but also a very threatening machine when they mobilize for protest. And therefore, they exercise a lot of power. And how this problem started, because it was an old problem. So again, we're going back in time. And of course, this problem of mobilization started even before then in the 40s. It started during the Mexican Revolution. But the key point was in 1943, when hundreds of unions in Mexico unify under one single union, the Sindicato Nacional de Trabajadores de la Educación, the CENTE, which was now the only union in Mexico. And at that moment, in 1943, the CENTE crafted an alliance with the PRI. At that moment it was the PRM, but it was the same, which was the hegemonic party and the government. And basically the political logic of that alliance was that the union, which since then had an outstanding ability for political mobilization, the alliance got votes for the PRI, and also the CENTE helps the government to contain unions demonstration and also to contain salaries. So, and in exchange of that, union leaders got political privileges. So for instance, the CENTE was the most efficient political machine organizing voters for the PRI, both in cities and in the countryside. Teachers' union controlled the poll stations, basically during the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and part of the 90s. And they were extremely effective. They were the political force of the PRI. One of the leaders of the union in the 70s, Longitud Barrios, said that teachers were the plumbers of the electoral system in Mexico. And by the way, the leader of the CENTE, this leader, Longitud Barrios, was at the same time a senator. He was member of the board of the PRI. He was also a governor. And at some point, he was also the director of the Social Security for teachers and for public officials. And so it was an example of how this alliance worked. And also the union received a lot of organized subsidies in order to mobilize even more teachers. So centrally, the educational institutions in Mexico incentives political mobilization and not teaching. And some of those incentives or subsidies were, for instance, the rules for teaching profession incentives labor homogeneity and link wages to collective bargaining, which creates incentives for mobilization. Of course, the union, the CENTE, was granted the monopoly of the union representation. The government automatically discounts the union dues. So every year the union received multi-millionaire budget without even making the effort to try to get the dues or the fees from the teachers. The government also paid for full-time political activists for the union. Before the educational reform, around 55,000 teachers were working full-time for the union paid by the government, and they were political activists, an army of political activists. By law, half of the teachers were hired by the union. Basically, leaders of the union control the distribution of social benefits for teachers. They control the system of payment for teachers. They also exercise a lot of influence on the administration of the normal schools, the teachers' universities in Mexico. And as I said, they also control the professional career of teachers, the control of the process of hiring and promoting teachers. And there was as well a lot of corruption. For instance, union leaders in alliance in many cases with party leaders and with government officials. Sometimes they sold the teacher's position, so you can buy a position. Imagine that, or you can inherit a position. If your father was a teacher, you can inherit his position. So under those conditions, as you can imagine, of course, you had a political machine, but the level of professionalization and the support for teachers to do their work at classroom was basically zero. And it was impossible for teachers, despite the huge efforts of many teachers, it was impossible to really have a professional career in Mexico at that moment. Well, you might think that after democracy, that problem could have changed. And actually, many people said, well, when Mexico became a real democracy and the union and the hegemonic party disappears, then this problem is going to disappear. But it was not the case. On the contrary, with democracy, this problem exacerbates. So now we are in the year 2000. The PRI, after 70 years, lost the presidency, and a new government from a center-right party from the PAN now was in government. However, at that moment, the teachers union, the CENTE, disaffiliated from the PRI and founded its own political party. And at that moment, the union started to follow a new flexible strategy, making electoral alliance, not only with the PRI, but with all political parties. And actually, the power of mobilization of the union was even more important now because we had competitive elections. So it was important before because although we have an hegemonic party, elections were very important. You know, that was a particularity of the Mexican political system. We can discuss it. But now elections were, of course, even more important. And now the union was making alliances with all political parties. And the capacity or the power of mobilization was even more important. So between 2000 and 2012, the union created an alliance with this center from it's a right center party, the PAN, and basically they were able to continue to be part of the ruling coalition. And basically they were able to keep all the conditions that I described, and actually they were able to get even more concessions. For instance, during the PAN government, during the government of President Calderon, between 2006 and 2012, the son-in-law of the leader of the union, the son-in-law El Baster Gordillo, was the undersecretary of education. Imagine that. So, as I told you, this problem was even more, or it was exacerbated during democracy. And basically, as you can see, the problem was this one. No, teachers union get votes for political parties. In exchange of that, parties gave unions laws, position in Congress, and of course, unions threat, but at the same time, moderate protest. That was good for government, and in exchange of that, government also gave a lot of concessions to unions like collective bargaining, bilateral commissions, in order to have a veto on the educational policies. Governmental positions, many leaders, as I just have described it, were important officials within the Ministry of Education in Mexico. They control the social benefits for teachers and also teachers' career, and they're using those controls in a clientelistic and in patronage in favor of unions and political parties. So the center of the educational reform was to change that. The reform contained many things. We changed the curriculum. We create a new strategy for inclusion. We reorganized the schools, and all those things were very important. We create the first national strategy for early childhood education, and all those things were extremely important. Nonetheless, the most important element of the reform was the professionalization of teachers. And as I said here, it was one reform, but with two outcomes. One outcome on education and other outcome, and another political outcome. So we introduced with this reform mandatory merit-based evaluations for hiring and promoting teachers, merit payments, no tenures, and we create an autonomous institutions, a technical and autonomous institution in order to evaluate not only teachers, but also all the components of the educational system. And of course, union leaders were not anymore in charge of the professional career of teachers. We create this new civil service for teachers. The government take back the control of the administration of the social benefits of teachers. The government recover as well the control of the payments. We stop paying comisionados sindicales. Actually, the law forbid any kind of payments of that kind. And the result, after 5 years of doing that reform, the result was that the quality of teachers and students increased. And our results, there are some papers published in academic journals with peer review by very good economists of education, such as De Hoyo and Estrada, which basically prove that. It's not me saying that the reform was working, and the reform was working in order to have better teachers. But at the same time, this reform creates a huge political change. From my point of view, one of the most important political reforms after democratization, because the union lost its arbitrary control on teachers' career, and we transformed one of the biggest clientelistic political structures in the world in a new structure based on rights and duties and on merit and on merit and professionalization of teachers. So the result of that reform was that the union, basically the ability of mobilization of the union collapsed, and therefore the power of the union collapsed. As you can imagine, union leaders strongly opposed the reform. It was very complicated to implement the reform. So at the beginning of the reform, the union national leader was jailed on corruption charges. And after that, some sections of the union protest very strongly against the reform. They blocked roads, train roads. They closed, for instance, for more than 3 weeks, the border between Mexico and Guatemala. And while all the process of implementing the reform was very complicated, but at the end, the reform was successful. You can see here some pictures of teachers taking the exams. You can see here another picture because I was, every morning when I was Minister of Education, I was first Chief of Staff of the President, and then I was Minister of Education, and I was in charge of implementing the reform. And I was every morning in the schools having an open discussion with teachers and with parents and with all the media watching all these debates, explaining the reform, listening to teachers and campaigning for the reform. But also it was very important that teachers could listen why we were doing that reform and why this reform was good for teachers. So at the end of the administration, the reform had a 70% of support from the population and 60% of teachers support the reform. And as I already explained, as the reform progressed, the mobilization of the unions decreased, and we were able to negotiate with the union, but in a different balance of power in favor of the reform. However, in the election of 2018, we lost the presidential election, and the new government made again an alliance with teachers' unions, centrally with leaders, and they reversed the reform and they reestablished the old status quo, which started to function exactly with the old the old mechanisms. Unions leaders get votes for the new party in government. Union leaders as well were able to control demonstrations, and leaders started to have again some privileges and started to have again some positions in Congress, for instance. Of course, from my point of view, this was very sad, but oh, that's politics. I don't have many time, but what I want to tell you is Mexico, of course, is an extreme case. However, is not at all the only case. After this process, I decided to take a break from politics, and I was very fortunate because I was invited by the School of Education here at Harvard to write a book about this experience, and I've been here for 3 years doing research. Now I'm part of the Weatherhead Center at the Department of Government here in Harvard as well. And now I'm writing. I'm close to finish this book, and of course the book tells. In that book I tell this story about Mexico with much more detail, of course, and about the reform and so on and so forth. But also it's a comparative work, because what I have seen when I started to write this book is that, as I said, Mexico is an extreme case, but basically you will find this problem in many other democracies around the world. So for instance, just in the last decade or in the last 15 years, very similar educational reforms have been reversed in many other countries. 5 years ago, it was reversed in Portugal. It has been reversed in the states of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and in Sao Paulo in Brazil. In Brazil, education is it's local, it's not federal. It happened here in the US, New York City, when Mike Bloomberg was mayor. He did a great educational reform, and the next mayor, in alliance with teachers union, reversed that reform. It had happened in Bolivia, and probably will happen as we speak now in Colombia. They are negotiating now to reverse some and a very important reform that Colombia did in the last 10 years. But it's not only the reversal of reforms. It is also that you can find in many countries the similar political dynamics between political parties and unions. And let me put you very briefly some examples about that. This is South Africa, which probably is the most similar case to Mexico. In South Africa, you have the South African Democratic Teachers Union, and this union has an alliance with the African National Congress, which has governed South Africa since 1984. And this union, SADTU, has co-governed the educational system in a very similar way as the CENTEDI. The union controlled the professional careers of teachers in a very similar way as the CENTEDI. And even, for instance, they have developed a very similar system of selling the teacher's position like in Mexico. And of course, the quality of education in South Africa is also very poor. You have also something similar in India, for instance, in many states of India. And the case of India in that it's more similar to Mexico, but Mexico under democracy, because unions there in India have developed a strategy of flexible alliance with different political parties. And in some states like Uttar Pradesh, who have 200 million people, the constitution grants predeterminate representation quota to teachers to the upper house. They have, without even votation, the 12% of the representation of the upper house. That's huge power. Also, in India, in many states, by legal mandate, or basically in all the country, by legal mandate, teachers handling polling stations, and they control polling stations. And there is a lot of evidence that they don't always use it in a good way. And finally, like in South Africa and like in Mexico, union leaders control the professional careers of teachers, and as well the results of quality education in India in many states are very low. And maybe you might think, okay, those are problems of middle-income democracies or developing countries. However, you will find very similar political dynamics also in high-income democracies. And one of the two best examples are the United States, where you have two main unions, the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers. And they have, since the 1960s, when collective bargaining was started here in the US, since then they have had an alliance with the Democratic Party. And both unions, I mean, this is shocking, both unions here in the US are the largest donors to both federal and state elections. So these two unions put more money in elections than any other union, but they put more money than any other industry. So teachers union here in the US put more money to elections than the oil industry, than the technology industry, than the defense industry, for instance. Teachers union, in average, are the 40% of the attending members to the Democratic conventions. So they exercise a lot of power electing the Democratic candidates. So they put the money, they elect the candidates, or they exercise a lot of influence selecting the candidates. And they also provide candidates with professional activists during elections. Here also in the US, you have an institution which are the school boards. School boards, which are the authorities of the school or school districts, and they are elected. And therefore, with this ability of mobilization, there is a lot of evidence that basically unions control the election of the school boards. So they also exercise or co-govern many school boards here in the US. They also can protest very strong. And as a result, the majority of teachers here in the US practice their profession under restrictive rules. For instance, salary and promotions are based on seniority and not on performance. And basically, it's impossible to fire teachers who perform badly. And despite the US has the highest spending per student in the world, only 14% of students here in the US is able to distinguish between fact and opinion. And it performs very bad in the PISA exams, for instance. And finally, another example. This is an example in Europe, France. In France, France has three main unions, and basically they co-govern with the Ministry of Education, the educational system in France. They have alliances with political parties, nonetheless, are less important because in France, you have these institutions which are joint committees for education policies, which are permanent institutions where leaders of the union have representation under those committees, and they basically have a power of veto of all the educational policies in France. So as a result of this, union exerts significant leverage over teachers' career and resource management within the educational system in France. Union leaders, like in the case of Mexico, also occupy relevant position within the Ministry of Education. Unions in France as well control a conglomerate of services for teachers such as loans, health services, and even tourism. And they mobilize for elections, but centrally they mobilize for protest, because with protest, they are able to pressure the negotiations of those committees. So for instance, between 50% and 80% of union members participate in the strikes or protests organized by leaders in France And on average, since long time ago, on average, in France, you have 8 strikes per year by teachers' unions. And as a result of that as well, salary and promotions are based on seniority and not on performance. And basically, it's impossible to fire teachers who perform badly. Basically, there are no evaluations there. And again, you have some bad results on the quality of education. Only 9% of the students in France are able to distinguish between fact and opinion. So finally, and I'm now finishing, as you can see everywhere, teachers' unions have a great power of mobilization, and they use that mobilization power for getting votes and for protest. And electoral mobilization and protest are very valuable for political parties and democratic governments, and therefore teachers' unions are very powerful in democratic regimes. And the main problem is that the policies that allow the professionalization of teachers reduce the ability of mobilization of teachers' unions. Why? Because those policies include, for instance, the recruitment of future teachers with diverse studies and professions, implement demanding and meritocratic recruitment systems and processes, determine, this is key, teacher salaries and competitive promotions based on performance and not on seniority, remove low-performing teachers from classrooms, and all these regulations, as you can see, creates incentives to concentrate on teaching and not on political mobilization. And these regulations also allows teachers to forge an individual career and salary based more on their performance and less on their periodic negotiations of collective bargaining, which incentives mobilization. Therefore, good teachers have less incentive for political mobilization, and therefore diminishing the power of unions and affecting the interest of many political parties. And that's why union leaders in alliance with political party leaders normally reject or block these kind of reforms, and this creates a problem everywhere for the quality of education. And this is a central paradox for freedom and democracy for the 21st century, because on the one hand, of course, elections and collective actions are fundamental and central elements for democracies, but at the same time, those elements are in tension with the quality of education, which also is fundamental in order to exercise freedom and in order to have a democracy. So therefore, you have then a hidden paradox, because this phenomenon is not very well known, but it is a fundamental paradox for freedom and for education in the 21st century. And as you can see, it's extremely difficult to solve it because it's not a technical problem, but a political problem. So now I'm finishing, and thank you very much for your patience and for your interest. And if you have time for comments or questions, I will be more than happy to be with you and to have this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aurelio. That was really, really a wonderful overview of everything you've done for the reform of education, and very helpful context for a lot of us, especially me as coming from outside of Mexico. I think that was really, really great to hear. So thank you again. We have a few minutes. Let's open up for conversation and for questions from the audience. Everyone, please either raise your hand or just unmute yourself to speak and ask a question. If you add it to the chat, then we'll ask it as well. Maybe I'll start with a question in the meantime. And Aurelio, I'm really wondering, like you mentioned at some point that working with the schools throughout the reform got a very good response as the reform was being rolled out, and that the opposition to reform really, really diminished. And I'm really wondering if you have any anecdotal like quotes, or I wonder what made people think differently about the reform as they saw it implemented. What was their like response in the sense of like, what was it that it made them much more positive about it when they saw it happening?
Yes, of course. Well, for instance, in the case of teachers, at the beginning, and it was normal, they were suspicious about exams. It was something new for them, and of course, there was a lot of propaganda against the exams and that kind of things. However, as soon as they started to take the exams and they started to prepare for the exam, and they started, for instance, to get promotions, not because the union's leaders helped them to get those promotions in exchange of political work, but they started to have those promotions because they performed well in exams, and basically because they were doing well at schools. They started to see, well, that's much better. And they started to feel free. For instance, you asked me about an anecdote. Many teachers, after they started to, first of all, receive better payment because of their performance, and because they started to get promoted because of their performance and the exam, and they started to be higher because of the exams, many of the teachers told me, well, now I feel autonomous. Now I'm starting to feel really free. Like I'm starting to feel that everything depends on me and depend on my work and depend on how I perform in the classroom. And I can finally do what I really want to do. And I don't have to be worried about the union's leaders or the parties, or I don't have to be mobilized for elections. If I want to support a party, I can go, and that's fine. But not in a forced. I mean, not in a coercive way. So they started. I mean, many teachers started to tell me, well, I feel free, I feel autonomous, and I'm very happy. Let me tell you another thing. In Mexico, 2/3 of teachers are women. Okay, 2/3. However, before the reform, the directors, the principals of schools, and the supervisors of the school districts in Mexico were not women, were men. So only 1/3, despite there were 2/3 of teachers, only 1/3 of principals and supervisors were women. Why? Well, basically because before the reform, those positions were selected for political criteria, no, for political mobilization, and it was decided by union leaders, and it was a political criteria, and it was as well not a very unequal one for women. But as soon as we started the exams, and those positions were not anymore dependent on leaders union, but on the performance of teachers and the results of the exams, it was incredible, because then it started to show the universe of teachers, and 2/3 of women started to be principals and also the supervisors of the districts. So that was as well a huge change, and a huge change on equity as well, and a huge change of fair for women. And it was result of this process of changing the rules for meritocratic rules instead of political clientelism.
Oh, that's really great to know. I'm curious whether this kind of data is being used for any like experiments in terms of determining this causal effect on gender. I think that would be really fascinating to show. And it sounds like a really wonderful way to analyze that.
Yes, I don't know if someone is working on that, but yes, I mean the data is amazing, because as soon as those exams started, it's incredible how you started to see the change, and you started to see how that the unequal representation of women on important positions within the educational system was a result of politics. And as soon as you take out politics and you put meritocratic processes, then change it, and then you have 2/3 of principals started to be women because 2/3 of teachers are women. Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah. There's a question in the chat from Aurelio Juarez. What are the themes of the political mobilizations of teachers around the world? Are those protests, quotes, necessary?
Well, it depends. In some cases, yes, but the problem is that in many other cases, union leaders are able, as I think I showed you in the case of Mexico, but you will have similar cases in many other countries, such as South Africa, India, but even here in the US or in France or in many other democracies. Union leaders are very powerful, and not always they are really respondent to the interests of teachers. They can be independent because they have a lot of power, and basically the power comes from government and from political parties. So for instance, if government delegate to unions, like in the case of Mexico, they delegate the ability to control the professional career of teachers, and our leaders, union leaders, the ones who decide the promotions and all the things that I already explained, they exercise a lot of power on teachers. And in many cases, they can force teachers to mobilize for election and to mobilize for protest. So in some cases, you can see that the majority of teachers, for some reason, they want to strike or to mobilize, and that's fine. I mean, I'm in favor of unions. And however, in many other cases, it's quite obvious that teachers are forced to mobilize. In the case of Mexico, it was very obvious because they had the control of all those things. For instance, let me put you an example. In the case of the state of Oaxaca in Mexico, and the CENTE, which La CENTE with C, not with S, La Coordinadora, as we call it, is it's another union. It's a fraction of the union, but they behave exactly the same as the union, the CENTE. Well, there they had a rule, and the rule was that if a teacher wanted to be promoted, or if a teacher wanted to be hired again, they had to have an 80% of participation, but not a participation at the school, 80% of participation at the demonstration of the union. So I mean, that's coercion. That's not the teachers going to demonstrate because they are angry with something. So that's why teachers unions everywhere can mobilize very heavy. I mean, I didn't present here all the data for my book, but actually I think I can prove that, and I can. And in the book, I present with a statistical analysis data from basically more than 30 democracies, and I show that teachers unions are the group that mobilize more, both for elections and also for protests, which I mean, in some cases it's natural, but I mean, you cannot explain those levels of mobilization without the power of leaders. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but what I want to point out is that in many cases, and this is one of the main problems for educational systems in democracies, are that mobilization is not authentic. Mobilization is controlled by union leaders, and they use that power not in order to help teachers, but in order to help themselves, and in order to be more powerful, and in order to create pressure to governments, and to be more important, and to have control of unions, and they have control of multi-millionaire budgets, and they are negotiating with educational ministers, with Congress persons, with Congress people. They are important. They are TV shows. I mean, they are political actors because of this ability of mobilization. And well, the Mexican case is probably one of the most important cases, but here in the US, probably the most important case here in the US are the Chicago Teachers Unions. If you're interested in this issue, I recommend you, it's a very good documental. I will give you the name in a minute. And in 1 hour, it's a very well piece of, it's a documental done by the Institution of Policy of the state of Illinois. And you will see this problem reflected there. It's I think the name of the documental is Zone 1 or something like that. Well, I will check it, but yeah. So thank you.
Great, thank you. If you'd like to send it to us later on, we can share it. We're winding down. We're towards the end of the colloquium. So if there's any final questions, thoughts, comments that people had, please feel free to ask.